Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in a few minutes here. Welcome, everyone. To anyone who's viewing on YouTube, we'll get started in about 3 minutes. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in a few minutes here. Thank you to members of the public who are joining us. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. We'll start real soon. Welcome, everybody. Let's give folks a few more moments to trickle in. I see more members of the public joining us. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome, welcome. Thank you to members of the public and others who are here with us today. Welcome, everyone. I'm seeing the public attendee list tick up but knowing that our time is limited, I think we should get started. So my name is Sophie Glass. I'm a facilitator with Triangle Associates, and we are here for a public webinar that's going to talk about equity in the integrated resource plan. This was one of the meetings when I saw the work plan that I was really looking forward to, and here we are. So you can go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the webinar tools that are available to you, if you are a member of the public or participant, you can use the Q&A feature throughout the meeting, and we'll be giving you lots of opportunities to ask questions, and we'll address some of those live verbally, and some of them we'll write out if we're able to. The public comment period at the end, that's when that raise hand feature will be available to you. And then the chat button is a chance to see messages from the host. And we are, just a heads up, going to send out an interactive whiteboard as a link, so that will come through the chat. And if captions help you, those are enabled. Next slide, please. So my request is just, be constructive, be courteous. I'm trying to move us through, but also make sure to leave room for your questions. So finding that balance. If you're a member of a PSE advisory group, we ask that you just prioritize input from the public, knowing that as an advisory group, you have other access to PSE. The feedback form or that email address, irp@pse.com, is there for you to provide additional thoughts and feedback as you'd like. And we're going to focus on equity in the IRP today. Let's try to focus on that, and we'll get to hear your voices during the public comment session. So next slide, please. Our safety moment. I did not know this. June is National Safety Month, so don't leave sharp objects or utensils misplaced or unattended, especially if you have a 3- and 5-year-old like I do. Make sure electrical cords are tucked away. Be careful with flammable liquids, chemicals, anything producing fumes. Always install stable and sturdy railings on both sides of stairs. We need to do that. And then check those smoke detectors regularly and replace batteries. Next slide, please. So the speakers today are all from PSE. Your experts are all kind of housed within the utility here. So Troy Hudson, the Director of Energy Equity, Brian Tyson, the Manager of Clean Energy Planning and Implementation, Alexandra Karpoff, the Energy Resource Planning Analysis, and Tyler Tobin, the Senior Energy Resource Planning Analyst. Next slide. So our agenda, Brian will kick it off with some kind of welcome and recap where we've been. We'll turn to Troy for an energy equity program overview. Brian will then pick it back up and talk about equity in that integrated resource plan and how things have evolved. You'll hear from Alexandra next about the benefits and burdens of generic electric resources. Tyler will then talk about electric portfolio benefits, analysis, improvements, and maximum customer benefit sensitivity. Brian will wrap us up with the gas portfolio equity analysis, so thinking about the gas side as well as the electric in this meeting, and we'll close with public comment. So that's going to be our agenda for today. And actually, before I turn it over to Brian, I did want to just bring Kara on. I know PSE has sent out some information today, and Kara just wanted to put some words to it. So Kara, please go ahead.
Thanks, Sophie. Good afternoon, everyone. So we will be jumping into the equity conversation shortly. And I just wanted, before we did that, to let you all know that PSE did move forward with a filing yesterday at the Utilities and Transportation Commission, seeking to transition our current 2025 IRP process towards preparing for the new Integrated System Plan, or ISP, approach. And PSE is excited to get started on the new ISP, and we need sufficient time to develop it and time for meaningful engagement with customers, with the public, and our advisory groups. So we did submit that filing just yesterday, and as Sophie noted, there have been some email communications that have gone out, and we'll just have to wait and see what the next steps look like at the Commission on that. Either way, today's discussion on equity is really important and relevant to our work, and we'll be incorporating it either into our 2025 plans, or if the Commission approves our filing, into the 2027 ISP. So this is all still timely, and with that, Sophie, I think we're almost ready to dive into the rest of the content. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kara. I'm just scanning the Q&A box. I'm not seeing any questions or reactions to that quite yet, but if anything jumps into your mind, feel free to drop it into that Q&A feature. So thanks, Kara. Let's turn it over to Brian and get us to the next slide, please, Will. Take it away, Brian.
Okay, thank you so much, Sophie, and thank you all for being here. It's an exciting topic today as we talk about equity in the integrated resource planning process. We have a number of content and slides to get to, and we've got some experts, Alex and Tyler. We're going to talk more in depth about the process as well. But again, this meeting is focused on how do we consider equity throughout our integrated resource planning process, both on the electric and gas side. And we'll do that at a pretty high level here. And then there will be points in time throughout the presentation where we'll look for feedback and do some whiteboarding and things like that from the group that we have here. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, this slide, I think you all may have seen at the previous public webinar, but if not, this just gives you an overview of how we're thinking about carrying these conversations, both from the public and from the advisory group perspective. We've already had a conversation with our equity advisory group back in May, really highlighting some of the same material you'll see today. Today, we're focused again on gas and electric. We'll talk to the RPAG, our technical advisory group, about the gas and electric as well in future meetings, and we'll go back to the equity advisory group as well on the gas side. Again, the point here is to understand and have some of the discussion related to our approach, and we'll have opportunities later on to break that out and to hear from you all here. If we can go to the next slide. This just gives you an overview of the IIP2 spectrum, how we blend in what you saw on slide 8 into what we're thinking about in terms of that spectrum here. So as you can see, we're really encompassing those first 3 levels of informed, consultant, involved as we move through a lot of these conversations as it relates to equity here. Now, before I turn to Troy, he's going to give us an overview of equity at the enterprise, the PSE level, before we really dive into the resource planning process. Sophie, I'll stop here, see if there's any questions as well.
Thanks, Brian. I'm looking in the chat. I'm not seeing any open questions. So I think, thank you, Brian. We'll come back a little bit later, but do you want to go to the next slide, please, Will, and bring Troy on?
Hi, Troy Hudson, Director of Energy Equity here at Puget Sound Energy. First, I say thank you for the opportunity to update you on our efforts since we started this program over the last 18 months. Next slide. So we've organized ourselves to focus on 3 sort of key goals. The first one is meeting our regulatory requirements, which are fairly extensive, operationalizing equity across all of our key operational programs, and then strengthening partnerships and enhancing engagement. We're also using the guiding principles that we developed with our equity advisory group. So we're focused on accountability, simplicity in a lot of our solutions, and then making sure that we focus on transparency in everything that we do. Next slide. So, equity is a process. It's not an outcome. So we're not going to end up with a place where we say, oh, we have equity. It's a process. And this is the framework that the commission has asked us to follow. And so, don't try to start memorizing recognition, justice, and all of the others. One easy way to think about it is recognition is really about the who. Who are the populations that we need to make sure we're focused on to make sure that we are getting them the support they need so that they can become part of this process. And then we have procedural. How do we engage with those populations we've just identified? how do we meet them where they are? And you'll see some of this, a lot of this reflected in the conversations as we go on today. The third one, distributional, is what benefits do we provide and what burdens do we reduce? Very quantitative at this stage of the process. And then finally, restorative. What structural changes do we make and sustain to make sure that we are addressing the systemic inequities that we have inherited as part of this equity journey. Next slide. We're trying to focus on the customer journey and how we're thinking about that as an overall program for equity. So, you know, the customer relationships piece require sort of coordinated and aligned engagements centered on the customer and the community. This is probably the most challenging part of this, but also the most important, because we have generally tended to think of our programs in silos. So we're doing a weatherization program, or we're doing energy efficiency, and this requires us to be more aligned and coordinated, and think about the customers and the communities that we're trying to reach. So we've had some forums that we've organized, but we're trying to start aligning our work so that when we meet customers, we're being very efficient in how we use their time, to make sure that we are considering them in what we're doing. We have some specific programs we're focusing on for billing relief, and then programs to reduce energy use and help those customers and communities transition to a clean energy future. Next slide. And then this is the final slide here. You'll see in red over there, integrated resource plan. So a lot of the conversation today is about that, and I won't say much more about that. But as you can see here, we're focused on these other use cases as well. So resource acquisition, our delivery system, facility design, siting, and construction, the customer programs I mentioned a little bit a few minutes ago, and then sort of the specific actions and the goals and targets required from our clean energy implementation plan. So looking at minimum designations, specific targets, these are the approaches that we've taken and the things that we're trying to do. So since you'll be hearing a lot more about this and how it plays out in the IRP, I'll stop there and see if there are any questions before I hand it back.
Yeah, thank you, Troy. I see one question from Thomas Kramer about how does PSE identify low-income customers? Is that a self-identifying process?
So there are requirements for what's considered low income, but for a lot of our programs, we have moved to self-attestation. So the customer, looks at what the requirements are, determine whether they meet those requirements, and then they attest to that. And then we do sort of an audit, I think maybe of a certain percentage, just to make sure that there is some compliance and accountability.
Great, thanks for explaining that, Troy. Any other questions from members of the public? Okay, Troy, I'm not seeing any. We could turn it back to Brian now.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Troy. So let's go to the next slide. And now we're back to resource planning, because this is really what we want to dive into in thinking about equity and resource planning. I'm going to first sort of set the stage for both the electric and the gas side, give a little background, and then Alex and Tyler are going to give a bit in-depth look at the approach that we've deployed and you all have helped us to deploy and create over the past iteration. So if you could please go to the next slide. Most of you are familiar with structured PSE and the dual the dual fuel utility structure that we have here, both on the electric and the gas side. We obviously have some service overlap where we are fully just gas or fully electric, and then areas where we have both gas and electric as well. When we talk about gas, there's going to be sort of two contexts that we use. One is the use of gas in terms of electricity that we use to produce electricity, that is, and the other is the delivery of natural gas to our customers for heating and cooking purposes. And so when we talk about gas in terms of electricity, that'll be on the electric portfolio side. And then when we talk about sort of the natural gas pipes distribution side, that's for the gas utility side as well. And so just keep that in mind as we dive deeper into the electric portfolio analysis and the gas portfolio analysis later on. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, please. So now overview of resource planning. For our integrated resource plan, that's our really long view, 20+ years, where we think about a variety of resources that could be used to meet and fill a need that we may have in that time frame. Now from there, from CETA, we jump down to a 10-year view. Now this is getting a bit more granular in terms of the assumptions and the inputs, but also spelling out some actions that we could take over that 10-year cycle. From there, we get even more granular to a 4-year view in the Clean Energy Implementation Plan, which again, more specific actions, but thinking about what are we doing in this 4-year chunk as opposed to the 10 and as opposed to the 20 as well. The discussion today is focused on what we do in that 20-year view, that integrated resource plan view, thinking about generic resources and generic assumptions and benefits and burdens for generic resources over that 20-year, that long period there. Okay, next slide, please. So how do we actually get to that plan? A lot of it comes from some complex modeling that's done, also comes through a lot of the engagement, the dialogue that we have with parties throughout this process. But first, it really starts with gathering data on resources. And I think this group has had conversations with generic resources and other resources that we may consider in this modeling process. So that's one of the first pieces of building that model. The next piece is then, of course, having this public participation process. That's what we're doing now, and that's what we've done in the past, and we'll continue to do to bring in that feedback, that discussion into the model itself. Once we have all those inputs, we'll then run the model, and it tells us a need. It determines what is the need for our electric side, what's our need for the gas side of the business as well. That's when we get into what's called a portfolio benefit analysis. Now, this is the sort of the second iteration that we've done this. We did this before in the previous IRP and electric progress report, but this is where we want to focus some of the attention on. This is where Alex will touch on later today. But the portfolio benefit analysis, that's where we start to understand the benefits that we believe customers may see from a particular portfolio. And this is going back to what Troy talked about in terms of distributional justice, really understanding what are those tangible benefits, non-energy or otherwise, that customers may see, and how would those benefits be distributed throughout our customers, especially our most vulnerable or highly impacted customers within our service territory. Now, part of the portfolio benefit analysis uses something we call customer benefit indicators, and Alex and myself will touch on what that means later on. Okay, can we go next slide, or do we have a question, Sophie? I think I've got
no questions yet.
Okay, I think I've got a couple more here. Okay, so recap, I mentioned again, we've done portfolio benefit analysis in that previous iteration. We engaged you all and the EAG and other advisory groups on what that portfolio benefit analysis design looks like. We used it to then make a selection in a preferred portfolio for the 23 electric progress report. And then we've also had some feedback since then that has helped us now craft the conversation we're going to have today and craft what we do in the future. So last time, I think we heard a lot of general support for using this analysis. There was a strong interest in cost benefit analysis and how that gets used. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes, or rather Alex will talk about that in a few minutes. There was also in feedback we heard in understanding what those benefits and burdens are. That's the key piece we're going to talk about today, is truly understand we have generic resources. So how do we understand the benefits or burdens of a generic resource, and then use that to understand the impacts in our resource planning process. The other concern we had was around weighting the benefit categories and what are the trade-offs there. A lot of the conversation we have today, I think, will tie into and dovetail into understanding trade-offs throughout this planning process. And then we also had some interest in adding a climate change resilience indicator, and we are continuing to consider that as a team. And how do we understand, how do we add or think about a climate change resilience indicator in the future? But all in all, this really just highlights, we heard a lot of information in the past for the past iteration, and we want to come back to it here. And hopefully the conversation we have today will really highlight and get to the heart of some of the conversation and the questions that came up, especially as it relates to understanding burdens and benefits and some of the trade-offs as well.
Great.
Okay.
Brian, there's a question in the chat that I just wanted to call out that might be actually requiring Troy to come back on. So I'll read the question aloud, and if we need to wait for Troy or someone else, we can go back to you. But the question is that Troy Hudson mentioned auditing self-attested low-income customers. So how does PSE identify low-income customers who don't know that they need to self-attest? Troy, any chance you could come back on camera and answer that one, or we can get an answer and put it in the chat later?
Yeah, let me take a stab at that. And I think I can keep myself out of trouble here. We've tried to streamline and simplify the application process so that a lot of the applications can be done using our online tools. And as you go through that process, the tool will prompt you to do the self-attestation.
Thank you, Troy. Okay, Brian, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Troy, for that. Thanks for the question, Thomas. We can go to the next slide. Yep, okay, I thought this is it. So this is just a reminder of the conversations that we've had, or that we plan to have. We've already had a discussion with the EAG, and here we are today, June 6th, to talk about gas and electric, equity in the gas and electric portfolio as well. So we can go to the next slide. This is my last one before I turn it to Alex, but I want to tie what I just mentioned back to what Troy mentioned about equity at the enterprise level. Again, having received guidance and understanding of these 4 tenets, wanting to just show how our approach and the integrated resource planning process, how those different tasks really tie to the different tenets we have here. So Alex is going to talk about understanding benefits and burdens, which requires us to understand, as Troy mentioned, the who. So understanding the who, but also understanding how each of these generic resources may provide a benefit or may provide a burden to specific groups of people within, near or around these generic resources. And then thinking about the distributional justice, where we think about the amount of, or who receives specific benefits, what magnitude or what level of benefits customers may receive. That portfolio benefit analysis gives us an idea. Again, this is generic, so it's still kind of high level, but it gives us an idea of what types of benefits could be received based on a portfolio that could be chosen. And then another scenario that comes through the CETA process is understanding, is there a scenario where we can maximize customer benefits, and thinking about what that portfolio may look like as well. So first, we're going to talk about benefits and burdens. Alice is going to talk about that. Then we're going to talk about portfolio benefit analysis. Alex will give that discussion as well. Then we'll move to maximizing customer benefits, and Tyler will dive into that. We'll close out on the gas side, and that's where I'll come back and wrap us up there.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm actually going to break in. That was your last slide, yes? Great. So I'm going to break in here. As Brian mentioned in the beginning, PSE is kind of looking at a broader swath of the IEP2 spectrum and really wants to kind of hear from you in a more active way as members of the public. And one way to do that is through an online whiteboard where you can kind of in real time take some notes, make some impressions. Of course, you can continue using the Q&A feature, but I'm going to walk you through that. So first and foremost, Pauline, can you drop in the chat aboard the mural link? So I'm going to share my screen. Let's boot that up. Give me a second. So if you click the link that Pauline posted there, you're going to get to a screen that looks like this. It's going to have a different name, but what I wanted to highlight is you're going to click view as a visitor. So you don't need to create an account. You don't need to sign in. Click the link that Pauline put there, click view as a visitor. It'll give you an opportunity to like make a funny name like, galloping giraffe or something, or you can just put your name. So I'll give everyone just a moment there to click the link that says mural in the chat and then view as a visitor. That should take you to a screen that looks like this, and perfect. We have a visiting ram, a visiting sheep, a visiting snail. This is exactly what I want to be seeing. So the four major topics that are coming before us, the generic resources, benefits and burdens, updated portfolio benefit analysis, maximum customer benefits scenario, and the gas equity portfolio equity analysis. As these speakers are walking through their updates and information, think about, what do you think about the proposed approaches discussed today? Are there other considerations that you'd like to see included? And these are all sticky notes here. And please, you're going to watch me just do test, test, test. You just write your thoughts in response to as this is going. If, let's say, you want to write a small novel or an essay, by all means, just drag. You can make the little, you can make the sticky note even bigger. That's your call. And if all of this online whiteboard stuff is not for you, but of course, you can still use the Q&A feature in Zoom as usual. So please, I encourage you to think about providing some feedback on the proposed approaches and add any other considerations. I'll watch the participant list, and if new participants join, Pauline, I'll make sure that we re-add the whiteboard, and maybe I'll even bore everyone with the same spiel once more. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and ask Will to reshare the screen and turn it over to Alex. Thank you, Alex. Go ahead.
Yeah, hello, everyone. So I'm Alex. I use she, her pronouns, and I am going to discuss today a new approach that we are proposing for evaluating energy burdens and benefits within the framework of the electric IRP. So as Brian mentioned, one of the things that we heard from interested parties after our 2023 progress report is that it's really important for us to better understand the potential burdens and benefits resulting from our IRP process. And so during our last cycle, during the progress report, we did consider equity in what we were calling the portfolio benefit analysis. And we will talk a little bit about the updates of that later on. Tyler will address that. But I'm really going to discuss how we are proposing to build upon this prior equity approach. So if we could go to the next slide, our objective today, and where we could really use your feedback on those green sticky notes up in the upper left-hand corner of the whiteboard, is we would love your feedback on this new assessment and approach to addressing equity. So Generally, we'd love to know what you think, and more specifically, are there considerations that we missed or elements that you would like to see us consider further? So with that, let's go to the next slide. So what we did is we really started with a question of how do we deepen our understanding of energy burdens and benefits resulting from our portfolio selection in the IRP. And what we came up with a ton of discussion and guidance from our internal equity team, is to look more in detail at the potential burdens and benefits inherent in generic resources. And what we are really hoping to achieve with this assessment is to really get a broader assessment of equity in the portfolio. And we think we can do that with this approach because we can really address qualitative considerations, whereas in our past approach, it was really heavily linked to quantitative output from our portfolio models. We also think that we can generally, on a very broad and pulled back scope, address some location and siting issues and questions related to equity. And finally, as we've developed a more comprehensive and company-wide equity approach, I think that this assessment that we're proposing also addresses our recognition justice tenet. And so again, it just sort of broadens our ability to assess equity in the IRP. So can we go to the next slide, please? Next slide, thank you. Before I get too much into how we are looking at equity in generic resources, I wanted to give a brief overview of what a generic resource is. These are pivotal components to developing our portfolio in the electric IRP. And, generally in this process, what we are ultimately trying to figure out is how to meet our customers' energy need into the future. And the demand forecast is where we start. This is what tells us our future customer needs. And the generic resources are what we use to meet this future need. So generic resources encompass all the different kinds of electric generating and storage resources. So they can be things like a battery array, a wind farm, a solar farm. But a key component to generic resources is that they are theoretical. So they don't exist, and they're not linked in any way to real projects, either planned or in existence. They really just serve as placeholders that help us, that we put into our model, and that help us plan for our customers' future energy needs. They are, however, generic resources are modeled after sort of the latest and greatest technology out there. And so I think what this little diagram shows here is that, this is super pared down from what we actually model in our IRP. But for illustrative purposes, I think one of the things to note here is that we put in the generic resources into our model, and then our model really optimizes for the best sizing in megawatts of each of those resources that will best meet the customer needs. And so in this little example, we put in a few different resources, a wind farm, a battery, and a thermal plant, and we get 1,500 megawatts of the wind and 500 megawatts of that. Sorry, my thing is on my other screen over here, of gas and 1,000 megawatts of the battery. And one thing not shown in this diagram is that also the model will provide us sort of the optimal schedule for bringing these resources online over our planning period. So how do we go about assessing the equity inherent in these theoretical placeholder resources? So if we can go to the next slide. So what we did is that we turned to literature that is out there already, looking into equity associated with building different projects and resources. So our sources included academic publications, as well as papers and presentations from different agencies, such as federal agencies. And what we saw in the literature were a set of recurring elements associated with more equitable outcomes in these real world projects affecting real communities. And so what we are proposing doing in our generic resource burdens and benefits assessment is using the set of recurring elements as metrics to guide a really qualitative and research-based analysis of the impacts of each of our generic resources that we're including in the IRP. So as we sort of further dove into the metrics, they did seem to shake out into 3 different scales of impact. So we've got a global impact. We have the impact of utility to utility customers. And a new resource can also impact communities and land adjacent or within a project footprint area. So it's entirely possible that these scales of impact will overlap given a certain resource, but we still found it really useful, I think, to evaluate equity at these different scales. So what I am going to do next is present the different metrics that we're considering at these different levels of impacts. But I am wondering if I should pause for questions or just dive right into the next slide.
I love pausing for questions. We're doing okay on time.
Okay.
So I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A. A reminder, the whiteboard is kind of for feedback. If you really have a question you want answered in the presentation, help us out by putting it actually in the Q&A feature, and that way we can track it. So I'll pause for just another moment. Anyone have any questions for Alex so far? Okay, Alex, continue.
All right, next slide, please. So starting with our global scale of impact, we have 2 metrics that we're proposing to evaluate at the scale. The first is greenhouse gas emissions, and the second is end-of-life effects. So the end-of-life effects are really considerations about what happens to the resource after its commercial life is over. So can it be repowered? Can it be repurposed or reused or recycled? And what might be involved in each of those scenarios, or does it need to just go into a landfill? Moving on to the next slide. Next, we are considering the customer scale of impact. And these are the impacts that end users of the energy produced by the new generic resource might experience. So these 5 metrics may look familiar because they're actually metrics for measuring the customer benefit indicators, or CBIs, that were developed in the CEIP. So these include participation in clean energy programs, home comfort, the frequency and duration of outages, access to reliable clean energy, and potential cost burdens that might become part of utility rates from adding a a different kind of resource. All right, so next slide, please. And so finally, we have 10 metrics that we're looking at on the resource footprint scale of impact. And this scale of impact really examines the experiences of the communities and the lands directly adjacent to or most affected by a new electric resource. So the first consideration, first metric we have up here is the question of whether a resource will be sited in a disproportionately impacted community or a named community. And really, this is, I know before I talked about how generic resources don't actually have a site associated with them, which is true, but we can make a best guess about generally where a particular kind of resource might be located. For example, we know that a wind resource is highly likely to be sited in a rural community, not likely to be sited in downtown Seattle. So we can make that kind of pulled back assessment of where resources might go. Juxtapose this to a distributed battery, which actually could be located in an urban center or in a rural area. It really could be located anywhere. So that is sort of like one way that we can take this assessment and get a little deeper into where these resources might be sited. The next metric that we are looking at is, will the energy generated by a new resource serve the local community, or will that energy be exported elsewhere? And for example, using wind again, any new wind resource that PSE installs for serving our customers is likely going to be installed in east of the Cascades, and therefore will need to be exported from that source to our service territory to serve our community and PSE customers. So the other things that we look at on this scale of impact include will there be any changes to land use? This can include changes to a view shed. Will folks in the community experience any differences in noise, in safety? What will happen to the outdoor air quality and to community health? Will installing a resource create jobs for the community? And if so, what kind of jobs might those be? Might they be full-time, part-time, unionized, excuse me? And then we're also looking at decommissioning effects. And this is a little bit different than the end of use effects that I discussed in the global scale. That was really looking at what might happen to those parts. And decommissioning effects here at this scale of impact is really looking at what might happen to the community. So will there be a loss of jobs for decommissioning a resource? Will the land on which that resource was located be suitable for use by the community, or will there be impacts to the land that will need to be mitigated? And then finally, what might happen to wildlife and plant communities in and around these new resources? So from here, if we want to jump to the next slide. To reiterate, our plan is to use all of these different metrics as a guide to do a qualitative equity assessment for each of our generic resources that we're considering in our IRP. And ultimately, how will we use this assessment? This assessment will be included as a narrative in our resource planning documents. So we have a section where we describe our generic technology in detail. And this includes like the costs of different technologies, the operating assumptions, market availability, and now it will also include this equity assessment or the assessment of the potential burdens and benefits. Furthermore, this assessment will help inform our portfolio benefit analysis, which Tyler will discuss imminently. And ultimately, this assessment will help us to better understand which portfolios contain the most equity enabling characteristics to assist in our preferred portfolio selection. So yeah, I think to summarize, we think this strategy will really broaden our equity assessment moving forward. And with that, I will turn it back over to Sophie or answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Alex.
Yeah.
So we do have a question in the chat. Joel asks, has PSE worked to quantify these benefits and burdens in a way that the IRP portfolio model understands and can optimize around, rather than doing a post-modeling portfolio benefit analysis? Thoughts on that now, or a feedback report question? What do you think?
I can take a stab at it right now, and maybe we can provide a little more detail. But I think that we did actually, yes, we did go down the road of trying to do some quantification of these potential burdens and benefits. And I think one of the things that we ran into was it's twofold. First, I think that we by sort of keeping a post-processing methodology for our equity assessment, we keep it really accessible and a little bit more easy to understand. If we go into quantifying burdens and benefits and then stick it into our portfolio, I think that becomes less accessible because it really gets into the weeds of the model itself, which is pretty highly technical. And then I think another difficulty in doing that is I think that it can be really hard to put a dollar value on, things that are really affecting people, right? Like, so I think that there was enough data gaps in that, and I think sort of we came to this conclusion that that it would be more accessible and clear what we were doing to keep it as a sort of a outside of our portfolio model, and then let the model do what it does best, which is solve for a least cost solution.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Alex. I appreciate you answering on the fly. For our participants, remember, questions that you want Alex or others to answer live, use the Q&A feature. Otherwise, I'm having a lot of fun seeing your little guest names buzzing around our whiteboard. And so please keep on just sharing comments that you want PSE to consider after the fact there. Alex, I'm not seeing any more Q&A at this time, so you can take a step back, and thank you so much for your presentation, and we can move to the next slide, please, Will. Okay, Tyler, you're up, and remember, you can kind of take notes live on that whiteboard as Tyler talks now, so take it away.
Great, thanks, Sophie. So I'm Tyler Tobin. I'm a planning analyst on the IRP team, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some updates we've made to our portfolio benefit analysis tool. Next slide, please, Will. So this slide illustrates a high-level overview of what our portfolio benefit analysis is and where it comes in our IRP portfolio development process. So the objective of our tool is to allow us to see which portfolios that we're developing as part of the IRP process contain the most equity-enabling features. We do this, as we mentioned, as Alex just mentioned, as a post-process to our portfolio development model, which occurs in Aurora, which is really geared toward finding a least cost solution. So that red box is our Aurora modeling, where we push in all those generic resources and we get our list of builds. And we run that model many times to look at many different sensitivities, and we get a number of different portfolios, as represented by the purple circles. And then all of those portfolios are entered into our portfolio benefit analysis tool, where we can look at how those portfolios are composed and, based on their composition, provide them with some sort of equity score, which we can then look at as it relates to the total cost of the portfolio, And that gives us a lot of relative information about these portfolios, which ones may be more or less equity enabling. So then we've got a dashed line back to our technical Aurora model, where we can use what we've learned from conducting this portfolio benefit analysis to generate more portfolios, to hopefully move in the direction of finding what we like to call our preferred portfolio, which is the kind of ultimate solution to our IRP process. So this process was in place starting in the 23 progress report. And I would encourage you all to, go take a look at that older document if you're interested in taking a deeper dive. We published it as a standalone Excel file, so you can get in and see all of our math. But we heard a number of comments and got a lot of feedback on how our portfolio benefit analysis was developed as part of the 23 progress report. And we've heard you and we want to make improvements. So we promised this was going to be an evolution through our planning processes. So the next slide is going to demonstrate what we've heard and some changes we've made to our portfolio benefit analysis tool. Next slide, please. All right, so I think we'll just go through the list. On the left side here is all the feedback that we've heard. And then on the right side is our response to how we've addressed that feedback. So the top item here is there's some uncertainty over our conversion from raw data into a portfolio equity score. So for those of you that have seen our model, we had a number of raw measures that came out of our Aurora portfolio model, such as greenhouse gas emissions, number of resources added to the portfolio. And we used some kind of complicated statistics to turn those into actual measures that we could relate to one another. And, I think that created some unease because it was kind of obscuring some results on how that math was done. So drawing from the work that Alex just presented, we're going to take those burdens and benefits and pass them into this model. And we created a generic scoring system where each benefit and burden will be assigned a 0 or a 1. So it's really transparent if that resource is contributing or not to that specific metric. So it's very clear from the start which resources contribute burdens and benefits, and you can track how those burdens and benefits flow through the entire modeling process. The next piece of feedback we heard was the inability to incorporate qualitative burdens and benefits. And I think Alex already mentioned that the burdens and benefits analysis that she just presented is great at addressing qualitative metrics, particularly by using the binary score that I just mentioned, assigning them a 0 or a 1. Even if we can't measure precisely how a given resource may influence a given metric, we can provide some indication to our process that provides some benefit or not. And then the rest of our tool is still very quantitative in nature. So we take that qualitative measurement and put it through a quantitative process to get an objective answer out the other end. The third line here is portfolio scores were dependent upon which portfolios were selected in the study. So in the 23 progress report version of the portfolio benefit analysis, all of the portfolio scores were relative to one another because we used some statistical measures that were subject to the data that was put into the model. So if you added one additional portfolio, all of the scores would change. And that felt less transparent than we wanted it to be. So we've gone forward with an absolute scoring system. So now if you add another portfolio to the list of portfolios in our tool, all those other ones will stay the same, and the new portfolio comes in with its own unique score. We feel that's more transparent and much easier to follow. So if you're looking at different iterations along the way, you're not getting different answers based on your initial input data. Fourth down the list here is we wanted to incorporate the portfolio benefit scoring as a cost metric into the into our Aurora portfolio model. And I think Alex nailed that last question from from our audience. We retain this as a post-process approach. We feel like having a clear distinction between our economic and equity modeling is important. It improves transparency and allows us to allow both of those tools to do what they do best, whether it's looking at the least cost solution or the most equitable solution. And then finally, we heard lots of concerns over weighting specific metrics. To address this, we started to move forward. We incorporated more metrics. So all of those metrics that Alex covered in her burdens and benefits analysis are as moved into this revised portfolio benefit analysis tool. So that expands upon the customer benefit indicators that we used as part of the 23 progress report. And we feel like having more metrics reduces any sort of reduces the importance of any one metric alone. And I would reiterate that we're going to retain an unweighted methodology. So whenever you have metrics, you can always throw weights at them. We're going to go forward where all metrics are weighted equally, unless we hear lots of feedback otherwise. We feel this keeps things fair, and whenever you start tinkering around, putting thumbs on scales, there's no end to the possible answers. So we're going to go forward with an unweighted methodology unless we hear lots of feedback otherwise. And that kind of covers our feedback and the major changes that we've made. I could pause for a minute, but
Sure.
The last slide just kind of shows what that looks like going forward.
The next slide, please, Will.
All right, so this looks very much like the first slide. You'll see kind of the core is unchanged. Taking into account all those feedback and revisions that we've made, you can see that I've added a box up front here to represent our burdens and benefits assessment. And all the research and literature reviews that Alex and her team have done will inform those generic resource equity measures. And those are scored before we even start putting resources into our portfolio model or doing any sort of portfolio benefit analysis. So we'll have those scores. And as those resource scores are set, and then we run the portfolio model, we get all of our portfolios and we can apply those burdens and benefits assessment scores to the resources that compose each of those different portfolios, run them through our portfolio benefit analysis, take a look at that cost versus equity score trade-off plot, which I've illustrated at the bottom of the screen, and use the findings from that information to then again evaluate and choose a preferred portfolio.
Very nice, Tyler. We'll take a pause here because I believe you have kind of a different topic you'll move into in a moment. Is that right?
Yeah. Let's if there's any questions here, happy to answer those, and then we'll transition to the related but different topic of the maximum customer benefit scenario.
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A. For those of you who are playing on the whiteboard, this yellow section is going to be where you'll put some reactions or thoughts in writing as Tyler continues his presentation. So you can go to the next slide. Go ahead, Tyler.
Thanks. All right, so changing gears slightly, we're going to talk about our maximum customer benefit sensitivity. Next slide, please, Will. All right, so some framework for what has established the kind of boundary conditions for the maximum customer benefit sensitivity. The WACC represented in this green box here is the rulemaking for the Clean Energy Transformation Act. It states that we have to, we as a investor-owned utility should run at least one sensitivity where a maximum customer benefit scenario is observed. So that says we have to do it. And then the RCW is what lays out exactly what that sensitivity should look like. So I think the crux of what this maximum customer benefit sensitivity is We want to ensure that all customers are benefiting from the transition to clean energy through the equitable distribution of energy and non-energy benefits, the reduction of burdens to vulnerable populations and highly impacted communities, long-term and short-term public health and environmental benefits, and reduction of costs and risks and energy security and resiliency. So that's a lot of context in a very short paragraph. And we're going to use the next slide to break down how we interpreted that. All right, so to orient you to this slide, this is how we started thinking about what are the burdens and benefits we want to assess as part of the maximum customer benefit scenario. So we pulled out some keywords listed in the category column. You'll see those words highlighted as part of the RCW that we just looked at: energy benefits, non-energy benefits, public health, environmental benefits, cost and risk reduction, and energy security and resiliency. So within those categories, we looked at the list of different metrics that Alex has just presented from her burdens and benefits assessment and thought about which of those metrics fit into those specific categories. And we wanted to maximize those specific metrics as part of any sensitivity that we wanted to run. So this list of metrics is, pretty long, but not fully inclusive of everything that Alex presented, but does cover a wide range of the metrics that she's presented. And then the final step was to think about which kinds of resources provided value to those specific metrics. And, we thought about this in the context of all the resources in our portfolio, but, we've got many, many different resource types. And we started to see a clear trend emerge that conservation, demand response, and distributed energy resources, including both solar and storage, provide many of these benefits. So we've assigned each of those a little icon and then ticked that icon next to each of those metrics where we think that those resource classifications would contribute to each of those metrics as a benefit. And since all of those benefits are covered by this kind of set of conservation, demand response, and distributed energy resources, we thought that maximizing those types of resources would be a great place to start for our maximum customer benefit scenario. Next slide, please. So taking that idea that conservation, demand response, and energy efficiency are kind of the resources that we want to maximize in order to maximize those benefits, those specific metrics that we just presented, we need to get into the nuts and bolts on how we're going to run that through Aurora. So the top bullet here just indicates that it connects us to our customers. We've done a number of customer surveys, and those surveys seem to suggest that local distributed resources are desirable. So that reaffirms that we're thinking about the same things as our customers. And then that sentiment is also reflected in our portfolio benefit analysis, where those three types of resources, distributed energy resources, demand response, and conservation, tend to score high in our portfolio benefit analysis tool. So taking that in mind, how do we maximize those resources? When we get in to do our portfolio optimization, we can set some constraints on our model to ensure that these types of resources are selected over other types of resources. And what we're going to do is, for distributed energy resources, we want to maximize the amount of those resources that are available in our model. So we are in the process of running a DGen model. That's NREL's, the National Renewable Energy Laboratories Distributed Generation Market Demand Model. And that model tells us what's the market potential for distributed energy resources in the PSE service territory. We'll get a result from that model, and then that result will go in as the ceiling for how many specific megawatts of distributed energy resources we could add to our portfolio. So under this maximum customer benefit scenario, we're going to take the full amount from that this DGen model suggests. For demand response, we're going to select all of the demand response programs identified as part of the 2025 IRP Conservation Potential and Demand Response Assessment. And I think we've already done a public meeting on the CPA, so hopefully that's still fresh in your minds. And then related for conservation or energy efficiency measures, we're going to select the highest cost conservation bundle from the 2025 IRP CPA, very similar to how we're approaching demand response. So those three categories will push in the maximum amount that our model can handle for all of those and allow our Aurora portfolio model to optimize around those decisions.
Great.
And I think that is my last slide.
Yeah, nicely done, Tyler. Let me pause again to see if anyone has any questions for the Q&A. There we are. So Joel writes, I didn't see icons on slide 37. So can you back up one slide, please, Will? Representing anything other than distributed resources, energy efficiency, and distributed solar. So did PSE consider other resources when trying to define which offer the most benefits? Question you can answer now, or is that a feedback report one?
Yeah, no, we did consider it. When we were putting this together, this slide, I did have many different resources on here, and certainly utility scale resources contribute a lot of these same benefits. But I felt like it got too cluttered, so it was kind of a presentation decision to narrow our focus just to the three types of resources that we are considering, and to illustrate that they tick a lot of these boxes. So it's not to say other resources don't, but these ones are a good selection.
Very good. Okay, another question here is regarding distributed energy resources. You mentioned NREL's DGen model, so the National Renewable Energy Lab's DGen model for estimating solar distributed energy resources. These are customer owned, but what about PSE owned distributed sources? Thoughts on that one, Tyler?
Yeah, so the DGen model, we can take a step up from the I think there's like several levels of potential in the DGen model. The technical potential, the market potential, and the economic potential. The economic potential is what illustrates where customers are willing to purchase those specific resources. We're going to move up a level in that to look at the market potential. So how many of those resources could exist in the region, which may not represent where customers are willing to make those purchases themselves. And that would be kind of the boundary condition where PSE may be developing community solar at commercial buildings and rooftops over parking lots, that sort of thing.
Great. Thanks, Tyler. Okay, we only have 20 more minutes left in this meeting, so I do want to move us along. So I think Brian is up one more time now.
Yep, I'm back.
All right, thanks for returning to the screen here. Wrap us up with talking about the gas side.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Sophie, and thank you, Tyler and Alex, for walking through our approach on the electric side. I will say before I dive into the gas side, much of it is pretty similar to the portfolio, excuse me, the portfolio benefit analysis that you heard Alex and Tyler talk through for the gas side, but I'll try to sort of distinguish and set up the, again, high-level overview of what we're thinking about on the gas side. If we can go to the next slide, please. So again, our gas IRP looks at the lowest cost approach for delivering gas within the region. Again, it's a regional overview is what I want to emphasize here. So we're not looking at specifically the distribution right to your home or things like that. We actually talked about equity in our delivery system planning process back in November. So I would encourage you to go back and look at those slides and look at that recording. But here we're thinking about equity in the analysis that we do across the region for the gas IRP side. So I'm going to walk through the approach at a high level. Again, should be similar to the electric side. It is really tough not to say electric slide, but it's similar to the electric side. And then at the end, we'll also ask similar questions to what Alex and Tyler had earlier about our approach, and really get your feedback there. And again, want to point you all to the mural that I think you all have been active and busy on providing some comments for. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so first I want to start with, before Alex and Tyler had talked about sort of the generic resources and the different resources that are considered on the electric side. Here we just have an overview of the various resources that we're evaluating on the gas side. So we think about energy efficiency, alternative, targeted electrification, natural gas, and these are the different elements that I'll touch on later as part of that portfolio benefit analysis. So we really want to understand these elements, want to understand the benefits or burdens of these elements as we create our portfolio benefit analysis. Okay, next slide, please. Now, before I get into the process, I do want to make a point, and this goes for the electric as well, which is, this equity as an input or as an output, as an evaluation, is part of the decision-making framework. We still have to consider decarbonization. We have to consider costs, codes, and standards. Just like an electric side, we don't just consider equity. There are other elements to consider as well. So I just want to make that point here, that this is just one key piece in making a decision on how we move forward. Okay, next slide. So here we get into the scorecard, the assessment, and really that portfolio benefit analysis. So we start with sort of indicator scoring for each of those individual resources. And by individual resources, I'm thinking of those 4 buckets we saw earlier. So we will score each of them based on how well they align or may not align with metrics, the customer benefit indicators in this case, across all of the ones that are applicable to the gas side. Then once we do that scoring, then we do the analysis and try to understand from a portfolio standpoint, how does the summation, the accumulation of the scores for the metrics within that portfolio, how does it then compare to other portfolios, and how are we distributing benefits or thinking about equitable outcomes with each portfolio. So again, similar to the electric side, where we are trying to give a bit of a score or understanding of, as Tyler talked about in the maximum customer benefit scenario, where certain resources may score a little bit higher just because of the benefits we believe could matriculate from a resource. We're doing a similar approach here on the gas side, just using those 4 specific resource types. And then I'll talk a little bit about the metrics themselves that we're using there as well. Okay, and then let's go to the next slide. Okay, and so this one is just a list of those metrics that we're considering in this approach on the gas side. So we believe these metrics and all of these are related to the customer benefit indicators from the CEIP. And so we would essentially ask ourselves, for each of these resources, how well does each of these resources improve participation in clean energy programming, and specifically with highly impacted vulnerable populations? Or how well does one of these specific resources improve home comfort or improve access to reliable and clean energy? And so if you're looking at a resource, you would ask yourself, for target electrification, does it improve participation in clean energy resource? And we would give it a score of 1 or 0 if it doesn't. We would do the same for target electrification. Does it increase the quality or quantity of clean energy jobs? Again, doing that scoring. And we do this exercise with each of the resources, with each of these indicators here. And then when we run our portfolio analysis, we look at it and ask ourselves, how does this portfolio compare to this based on the scoring within that portfolio that's been run behind the scenes there. Okay, so I know we're 15 minutes. Okay, getting close to time, but I do want to leave time for questions and feedback here. So if we could go to the next slide. This is where we ask the question, what do you think about this approach and evaluating some of the benefits and burdens of generic resources? And specifically, it should be for the gas resources here. Are there other considerations? I think you all heard Alex and Tyler kind of go deeper dive on the electric side. And so hoping this makes a bit more sense on the gas side as well. Of course, just with those 4 buckets of resources and using a little bit different set of metrics to show here.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brian. If people have comments or questions on this, they can put it in the chat, or we're about to go to public comment in about 3 or 4 minutes, so people can just verbally provide some feedback if they'd like to these questions. Otherwise, the mural board is still open. So let me pause and see, does anyone have any questions about what Brian shared about the gas side? Looking to see if there's open questions. I'm not seeing any open questions, but I do hope that everyone has the electric slide song stuck in their head for at least a day following this meeting. And you're not the only one who has made that slip up. It's not kind of a tongue twister. So, okay, Brian, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So let's go to the kind of next steps slides, and that'll get us to public comment at exactly 3:20. Okay, so here's what's coming up. The Resource Planning Advisory Group is going to also talk about equity in the IRP at a slightly more detailed level next week on June 12th. As you know, those meetings are available for the public to view as an observer, and so you can find information on PSE's website. The feedback form for this webinar closes on June 13th. So Pauline, can you just drop the feedback form link in the chat so everyone has it handy? So if you have any epiphanies tomorrow or feedback you want to provide, please, you can use that feedback form. That wraps up the meetings for this month, but next month there will be a Resource Planning Advisory Group meeting. So this is going to talk about gas modeling processes, scenarios, resource alternatives. There'll be a break in August. We'll exhale. And right now, tentatively, there is an RPEG meeting that's focused on the draft results and the decision process and a decarbonization update. So this public webinar setting is going to take a little break for the summer, but of course, those Resource Planning Advisory Group meetings are available for the public to observe. So next slide, please, Will. I think that's pretty much it. Okay, it is now the public's turn to talk. Pauline, can you activate the hand raising feature, and we'll get PSE on the line here. And let me share my screen with our timer because I have trouble keeping track of time. Okay, I see Mr. Jim Adcock has his hand raised. Let me share my screen and we'll make sure Jim is able to talk. So first off, Jim, can we do a little sound test? Can we hear you?
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Very nice. We can hear you just fine. Please, your public comment starts now.
Okay, equity in utility planning, meaning what is fair for everyone involved, is a difficult subject with no clear answer. Balancing the needs and costs between the more impacted communities, the average ratepayer who pays for all this, and the people around the world who are actually most impacted by greenhouse gas emissions from our natural gas. For example, the people of Africa. What helps no one is when utilities simply waste money by implementing foolish measures which are not cost-effective at the tasks they are assigned to do. I applaud efforts which cost-effectively attempt to reduce energy and burden on impacted communities while reducing the use of electricity, or which more effectively use electricity, such as heat pumps, and which also help prevent heat wave deaths due to climate change. But we need to be diligent to protect against just for show, pretend electric measures which do not actually serve these communities, which do not actually reduce electricity, and which do not actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And to be clear, I don't believe Puget is there yet. implementing methods which actually make a difference, which are cost effective in doing so, rather than being just for show, needlessly wasting ratepayer money. For example, I believe the use of hydrogen mixed into gas lines is not cost effective and is double counting regulatory game playing rather than solving any real problems for anyone. Whereas getting rid of gas and replacing it with heat pumps and induction cooking would also improve indoor air quality problems. Further, Puget needs to better implement real-world metrics when it comes to measuring these activities. I continue to recommend that Puget monitorize metrics as well as possible so that these efforts can be measured by traditional utility lowest reasonable cost measures. And so these metrics can be transparently sanity checked. Unweighted metrics are not necessarily fair. For example, including a metric which is not actually useful, or previously, Puget basically used the same metrics 5 times, leading to a 5 times weighting on that particular metric. I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Jim. I see Thomas Kramer. I see your hand. Let's see if we're able to hear you. Go ahead, Thomas.
Yes, can you hear me now?
I sure can. Your 2 minutes start now.
Okay. With regard to generic resources, it may be useful to distinguish between generic resources, even at the initial generic level, that are within PSE service area that would be controlled by PSE versus similar resources that are distant and require transmission into PSE's service area. There would be differences in cost, footprint, and reliability among other burdens and benefits. You mentioned that wind resources would all be from distant sources, but it would be different for solar. Generic utility-owned solar within PSE's service area would likely cost less, but may have greater footprint burdens than generic solar imported from a distant solar farm under contract. So distinguishing between distant and within PSE generic resources at the beginning of the planning process would help in later planning phases, such as determining the total transmission requirements needed by PSE in regional planning. And thank you once again for providing public access in the planning process. And that's all I have.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate those comments. Let's go to the participant list here. I'm not seeing any other hands. I'll pause for a second just to check. All right, then. Well, thank you to our public attendees and for PSE for your presentations. Remember that feedback report will be open for about a week or so. And so provide any other thoughts through that mechanism. And if I won't see some of the members of the public here at the upcoming Resource Planning Advisory Group meetings, I hope you all enjoy the start to your summer. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.